My family made all women cut out their own tongues, at 16, with red-hot pliers. To prove devotion, I found 47 jars of tongues in Grandma's study, including my mom's from 18 years ago. When I refused the ritual and sent evidence to police, Grandma strapped my 12-year-old cousin to the table and said, "Come home or she takes your place tonight," but the court acquitted her for religious persecution after her lawyer got a sympathetic judge. My family demanded all women cut out our own tongues at age 16 with a pair of red-hot pliers to prove devotion. I discovered this 2 weeks before my 16th birthday, when I broke into my grandmother's locked study looking for my confiscated phone. Instead, I found her collection. 47 mason jars lined the shelves, and each one held a human tongue floating in yellowed formaldehyde. The labels had names and dates going back 200 years. My mother's name stared at me from a jar dated 18 years ago. That's when I understood why every woman in my family wrote instead of speaking. Every woman except grandmother Vizara. My grandmother ran our family like a corporation. She controlled every marriage and every bank account and every major decision through her voice and their written responses. The outside world saw her as a pillar of the community who founded 3 women's charities and served on the church board. They never questioned why the Kavari women were so quiet while Vizara spoke for them all. She summoned me to the basement the next morning. The preparation chamber looked like an abandoned surgical room with leather straps on a metal table and medical instruments laid out on sterile cloth. She showed me the pliers first. They were ancient and inscribed with prayers, and the metal was stained dark from generations of use. "You'll heat them in the flame until they glow," she demonstrated with a blowtorch. "Then you grip your tongue firmly and pull while twisting. The heat cauterizes as you remove it so you won't bleed to death." My legs shook, but I forced myself to stay standing. She walked me through every detail. No anesthesia because pain proved devotion. I had to do it myself while the other women held me down if needed. My mother would be there watching. They'd already made my jar with my name etched in glass. "Your mother didn't hesitate," grandmother said. "The tradition passes from mother to daughter." I guided as my grandmother guided mine. She assigned me to live with the healed sisters for my remaining days. These women had all undergone the ritual and would prepare my spirit. That's when I saw the truth beneath their constant smiles. Their eyes burned with rage that contradicted every pleasant nod. They'd developed their own sign language that grandmother didn't know about. Some had scars where they'd tried to scream and torn their mouths. My cousin Nylith had tried to run 3 years ago. They dragged her back and held her down while grandmother directed the others to do it for her. Another cousin Zeraphine went insane afterward and tried to cut out her own eyes because she couldn't stand seeing what she couldn't speak about. The husbands chosen for us were specifically selected because they wanted wives who couldn't talk back or call for help. I found my mother's hidden journal wrapped in plastic inside the toilet tank. 20 years of suppressed words filled the pages, including, "I wanted to warn you, but how could I? She speaks, and we obey." That's when I decided to burn it all down. I set up hidden cameras throughout the house over 3 days. I documented the jar room and the preparation chamber and recorded grandmother explaining the ritual. I took photos of the medical tools and the signed contracts where husbands requested silent wives. On the 4th night, I discovered my 12-year-old cousin Lysandria would be next after me. I couldn't let that happen. I mailed copies of everything to local police stations and state investigators. I sent packages to journalists and documentary filmmakers and women's rights attorneys. I dropped USB drives at hospitals and counseling centers and anywhere someone might listen. I even left evidence with 3 different priests at churches outside our county. 47 packages in total, 1 for each jar. At Sunday dinner with all 43 family members present, I stood up and spoke out loud for the first time in weeks. I refused to cut out my tongue. I've already sent evidence to dozens of authorities proving those jars contain human remains. I've documented everything. Grandmother's face went white. "Sit down, child. You don't know what you're doing." "I know exactly what I'm doing," I said louder. "And investigators will be here tomorrow morning." Police sirens wailed in the distance. I ran. But grandmother had connections everywhere. She filed a $50 million defamation suit and claimed religious persecution. Her lawyer got a judge to issue a restraining order within days. The jar room was mysteriously sanitized before police served the warrant. My own mother stood with grandmother on the courthouse steps holding a sign that said, "I chose silence freely." Extended family members started showing up at my safe house. Dead animals appeared on my doorstep with their tongues ripped out. The investigation stalled when witnesses recanted their statements. Major religious organizations rallied behind grandmother claiming government overreach. Then Lysandria disappeared. The video arrived at midnight. Lysandria was strapped to the table in the preparation chamber with tears streaming down her face. Grandmother held the glowing pliers while speaking calmly to the camera. My mother and aunts surrounded them with blank expressions. "Come home for your ceremony or she takes your place tonight." Lysandria screamed, "Please help me," before someone clamped a hand over her mouth. The text came 30 seconds later with a photo of 2 jars. One had my name. One had Lysandria's. "Choose." I stared at the phone screen, my hands trembling. The image of those 2 jars burned into my retinas. One for me, one for Lysandria, my 12-year-old cousin who still believed in fairy tales and drew butterflies in the margins of her homework. I grabbed my laptop and pulled up the security footage I'd backed up to 3 different cloud services. The preparation chamber appeared on screen in grainy black and white. I zoomed in on Lysandria's terrified face, searching for any clue about their location. The background showed the same sterile walls I remembered, but something was different. A new medical cart sat in the corner with fresh supplies. My burner phone buzzed. Unknown number. I answered without speaking. Grandmother's voice came through clear and calm. "You have 1 hour. Come alone through the East Garden Gate. If you contact anyone or bring help, we begin immediately." The line went dead. I shoved essentials into a backpack. Pepper spray, a knife from the kitchen drawer, my remaining USB drives with evidence copies. My hands moved on autopilot while my mind raced through options. The police had already failed me once. The sanitized jar room proved grandmother's reach extended further than I'd imagined. The safe house door creaked as I eased it open. The street outside lay empty except for a single car parked 3 houses down. It had been there for 2 days. I slipped out the back instead, scaling the fence into the neighbor's yard. 20 minutes to reach the compound. I knew every path through these streets from years of forced family gatherings. The October wind cut through my jacket as I ran through alleys and backyards, avoiding main roads where grandmother's allies might spot me. The East Garden Gate stood partially open when I arrived. No guards, no cars, just the familiar iron scrollwork twisted into prayers prayers I could recite from memory. I pushed through into the garden where I'd played as a child before learning what my family really was. Motion sensors triggered floodlights that illuminated the path to the main house. Every window blazed with light. They wanted me to know they were watching. I forced my feet forward across the cobblestones, past the fountain where we'd taken family photos every Christmas. The basement door stood open. I descended the narrow stairs, each step echoing in the silence. The preparation chamber door waited at the bottom, cracked just enough to show flickering candlelight within. I pushed it open. Lysandria lay strapped to the table, her eyes wide with terror above the gag in her mouth. Grandmother stood beside her holding the ancient pliers. My mother and 6 aunts formed a circle around them, their faces blank masks I'd seen too many times before. Punctual as always, Grandmother said, "Remove your coat and take your place." I stayed by the door. "Let her go first. You're in no position to negotiate." Grandmother lifted the pliers toward the blowtorch flame. "Every second you delay is another second of fear for poor Lysandria." My cousin's muffled sobs filled the room. I saw the calculation in Grandmother's eyes. She needed this to happen tonight. The investigation might be stalled, but it wasn't dead. Too many people had seen my evidence for her to bury it completely. "I'll do it," I said, "but not here. Too many people know about this room now. We do it the old way, in the grove behind the property. Just family, like great-great-grandmother Amara's ceremony." Grandmother's eyes narrowed. She knew I was stalling, but tradition held power in our family. "The grove ceremony was recorded in our histories as the most sacred form of the ritual. The grove is overgrown," she said. "We haven't used it in decades. Then we clear it. Lysandria helps. She's young enough to still speak. Let her participate in preparing my ceremony instead of undergoing her own." I watched Grandmother weigh the options. Public pressure was building despite her connections. Making me disappear would raise questions. But a willing participant who chose the ancient way, that would strengthen her position. "1 hour to prepare the grove," she finally said. "Your mother and aunts will accompany you. Any attempt to run, and Lysandria takes your place immediately." My mother stepped forward, producing a length of rope. I let her tie my wrists, noting how she left the knots looser than they appeared. Her eyes met mine for just a second. A flicker of something I couldn't read. Something doesn't add up about how quickly Grandmother got that restraining order and cleaned out the jar room. She must have some serious connections to move that fast. I'm curious what kind of power structure lets her control judges and police like this, and why those 43 family members at dinner just sat there when she spoke up. They marched me out through the garden with Lysandria stumbling along between 2 aunts. The grove lay beyond the formal gardens where wild blackberry vines had overtaken the old stone circle. We'd need machetes to clear a path. "In the shed," Grandmother directed. "Aunt Meredith, fetch the tools." Meredith had undergone the ritual at 14, the youngest in our generation. She returned with rusty machetes and handed them to the others. Not to me or Lysandria. We were the sacrifices, not the preparers. They hacked at the vines while Grandmother supervised. I sidled closer to Lysandria. "Stay ready," I whispered when the chopping covered my voice. She nodded slightly, tears still streaming. Smart girl. She understood we weren't done yet. The work took 40 minutes. Sweat soaked through my aunt's clothes despite the cool night. The stone circle emerged from the vegetation, ancient symbols carved into each pillar. This place was older than the preparation chamber, older than the house itself. "Light the braziers," Grandmother commanded. They filled the metal bowls with oil and set them ablaze. Fire danced across the stones, casting writhing shadows. The space looked like something from a nightmare, which was exactly what our family had become. Grandmother produced the pliers from her coat. "Kneel in the center." I walked to the middle of the circle instead, staying on my feet. "Untie me. The ritual requires willing participation. After you kneel, I need to prepare myself properly." Great-great-grandmother Amara stood throughout her ceremony. I've read the account. Another lie, but Grandmother couldn't be certain. Our family histories were vast and contradictory. She nodded to my mother, who stepped forward to untie the rope. My wrists came free. I rubbed the circulation back while scanning for options. 7 women surrounded me. The woods pressed close beyond the firelight. If I could create enough chaos. "The words first," I said. "I need to speak the dedication." Grandmother smiled. "Yes, let everyone hear your willing submission." I drew a deep breath and began reciting in the old language. The words I'd memorized from dusty books, thinking they were just family history. Now they might buy me time, but I changed them. Where the ritual spoke of silence, I spoke of voice. Where it praised obedience, I praised rebellion. Grandmother's face darkened as she recognized the inversions. "Enough," she snapped. "You mock sacred tradition. I'm creating new tradition." I backed toward the edge of the circle. One where we keep our tongues and use them to speak truth. "Seize her!" My aunts lunged forward. I dodged left, shoving past Aunt Caroline. Her grip caught my sleeve, but the fabric tore. I sprinted for the tree line. "Stop or Lysandria pays." I froze, turned back to see Grandmother pressing the pliers against my cousin's throat. "I'm losing patience," Grandmother said. "Return to the circle or watch her suffer." Lysandria's eyes pleaded with me, but something else moved in the darkness beyond the fire. A figure slipping between the trees, then another. "I'll come back," I said loudly, buying time. "Just don't hurt her." I walked slowly toward the circle, watching the shadows. More movement. Someone was out there. But who? Grandmother's allies or something else? A branch snapped in the woods. Everyone turned toward the sound. That's when the first woman stepped into the firelight. Cousin Nylith, the one who tried to run 3 years ago. Her mouth bore the scars of forced silence, but her eyes blazed with purpose. Behind her came others. Aunt Thalia, who'd undergone the ritual at 17. Cousin Zeraphine, who'd tried to blind herself rather than see what she couldn't speak about. 6 women in total, all bearing the marks of our family's tradition. They'd learned to move without sound, communicate without words. Now they surrounded the circle, their own silent rebellion finally taking shape. Grandmother's composure cracked. "Return to the house immediately, all of you." But they kept coming. Nylith produced bolt cutters from behind her back. Zeraphine carried lengths of rope. They'd been planning this, waiting for the right moment. "You have no authority here," Grandmother snarled. "I speak for this family." Nylith signed something rapid and complex. The others nodded. They moved in unison. No longer the broken women Grandmother had created, but something harder, something furious. "Stop "Stop them," grandmother commanded my mother and aunts, but my mother stepped back instead. Then Aunt Caroline. One by one, the women who'd held me released their positions. The circle broke. Grandmother raised the pliers toward Lysandria. "I'll do it myself if necessary." I charged forward, but Nylith reached her first. The bolt cutters swung in a wide arc, knocking the pliers from grandmother's hands. They clattered across the stones and disappeared into the darkness. Seraphine and another woman wrestled grandmother to the ground. She fought with surprising strength for her age, screaming commands that no one obeyed. The silent women bound her wrists and ankles with practiced efficiency. I dropped beside Lysandria, working at her restraints. "It's okay. You're safe now," she sobbed against my shoulder as the ropes came free. Around us, the family that had enforced generations of silence finally found their rebellion. But we weren't done. Grandmother might be restrained, but her influence reached beyond this grove. The sanitized evidence, the stalled investigation, the judges and police in her pocket. We needed more than just this moment of defiance. Nylith signed to the others. They nodded and began pulling documents from their clothes. Pages and pages of testimony written in secret over years. Medical records, photos of scars, names of every woman who'd undergone the ritual for 2 centuries. They'd been gathering evidence just like me, but smarter, quieter, using their forced silence as cover while they planned. A car engine roared in the distance, then another. Headlights swept through the trees as vehicles surrounded the property. "My lawyers will destroy all of you," grandmother spat from the ground. "This changes nothing." But Thalia held up a phone, showing a live stream with thousands of viewers. They'd been broadcasting the entire confrontation. Every word grandmother spoke, every threat she made, now preserved where her influence couldn't reach. The first police car pulled into view, followed by news vans. The story was already spreading beyond our county, beyond grandmother's web of connections. I helped Lysandria to her feet as uniforms flooded the grove. This time they had witnesses, living evidence. A grandmother caught on camera threatening children with mutilation. As they led her away, grandmother turned back one last time. "This family is nothing without tradition. You've destroyed us all." "No," I said. "We've set ourselves free." But even as the police took statements and the news crews set up cameras, I knew this was just the beginning. Grandmother had resources, lawyers, decades of connections. The real fight was only starting. The police station buzzed with activity as officers processed grandmother's arrest. I sat in a small interview room with Lysandria pressed against my side, her small hands still shaking. Detective Martinez slid a cup of water across the table and opened her notebook. I recounted everything while Lysandria nodded confirmation. The detective's expression grew more disturbed with each detail. She excused herself to make calls, leaving us with a female officer who kept glancing at us with barely concealed horror. Through the window, I watched news vans multiply in the parking lot. Reporters jostled for position, their cameras trained on the entrance. The live stream had gone viral within hours. Comments flooded in from around the world, but I couldn't bring myself to read them. My mother appeared in the doorway. Her face looked haggard, aged 10 years in one night. She held a whiteboard and marker, the tools of her enforced communication for 2 decades. But instead of writing, she set them on the table and opened her mouth. A rasping whisper emerged, unused vocal cords straining after years of silence. The words came slowly, painfully, but they came. She was asking if we were hurt. I shook my head, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. My mother, who hadn't spoken since she was 16, was finding her voice again. Even damaged, even barely audible, it was hers. Detective Martinez returned with 2 other officers. They needed us to remain in protective custody while they executed search warrants. Grandmother's lawyer was already filing motions, claiming religious persecution and false imprisonment. The battle had shifted from the grove to the legal system. They moved us to a safe house outside the city, not like my previous hiding spot, but an actual police facility with reinforced doors and security cameras. Lysandria finally fell asleep on the couch while I paced the small living room, my mind racing through what would come next. My phone vibrated. Unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer, breathing on the other end. Then a whispered voice I recognized as my Aunt Meredith, the youngest to undergo the ritual. She was warning me that grandmother had been released on bail. Her lawyer had convinced a judge that an elderly woman with deep community ties posed no flight risk. The call ended abruptly. I stared at the phone, my stomach churning. Grandmother was free. The woman who'd threatened to mutilate a 12-year-old child was back on the streets within hours. Detective Martinez arrived at dawn looking exhausted. The search warrants had yielded nothing. The preparation chamber had been stripped bare. The jar collection had vanished. Even the medical instruments were gone. Someone had sanitized everything while we were at the police station. But the silent women's testimonies remained. Nylith, Seraphine, Thalia, and 3 others had provided written statements detailing their experiences. Grandmother's legal team moves faster than a teenager deleting their browser history. That preparation chamber got cleaned out while everyone was still filling out paperwork at the station. Medical examinations confirmed the damage to their mouths. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. Grandmother's lawyer held a press conference that afternoon. I watched on the Safe House television as he painted her as a persecuted religious leader. He claimed the women had undergone voluntary body modification as adults. The live stream video was dismissed as a theatrical performance designed to defame his client. Religious freedom groups began rallying to grandmother's defense. They flooded social media with messages about government overreach and attacks on traditional practices. Some even suggested the silent women had been coerced by me into making false accusations. Lysandria woke screaming that night. Nightmares about the preparation chamber, about the pliers glowing red hot. I held her while she sobbed, promising her she was safe, but I wasn't sure I believed it myself. The next morning brought more bad news. 3 of the silent women had recanted their statements. Their husbands had arrived with lawyers, claiming their wives had been manipulated while emotionally vulnerable. Only Nylith, Seraphine, and Thalia stood firm. Detective Martinez looked defeated when she delivered the update. Without physical evidence and with witnesses recanting, the case was weakening. The prosecutor was considering dropping charges to avoid an embarrassing loss at trial. I couldn't let that happen. I pulled out my laptop and began searching through the backup drives. There had to be something we'd missed, some piece of evidence that grandmother couldn't erase. That's when I found it. A folder buried deep in the encrypted files. Photos I didn't remember taking. They showed a hidden room behind the preparation chamber, accessible through what looked like a maintenance panel. In the images, shelves held more jars, fresh ones, with recent dates. I showed Detective Martinez immediately. She studied the photos, her expression sharpening. This was new. This grandmother couldn't have sanitized because she didn't know I knew about it. They organized another search warrant, this time keeping it quiet. No advance notice that might allow evidence to disappear. I provided detailed descriptions of the hidden room's location, based on the photo's metadata and background details. While we waited for news from the search, more family members began reaching out. Cousins I barely knew, distant aunts who'd undergone the ritual decades ago. They sent messages of support, shared their own stories. The family's wall of silence was cracking, but grandmother wasn't passive. Her lawyer filed harassment charges against me. He claimed I was conducting a smear campaign that had cost grandmother her reputation and charitable positions. The $50 million lawsuit was just the beginning. Then came the restraining orders. Not just against me, but against Lysandria too. Grandmother claimed we posed a threat to her safety. The judge, one of grandmother's longtime supporters, granted them immediately. Detective Martinez was furious. A 12-year-old victim being legally barred from testifying against her would-be abuser was obscene. But the law was the law, and grandmother knew how to use it. The search team found the hidden room, but it was empty. Fresh scrape marks on the floor showed where shelves had recently stood. Someone had cleared it out, probably while we were discovering the photos. We were always one step behind. Lysandria grew quieter each day. The brave girl who'd understood my signal in the grove was retreating into herself. She flinched at sudden movements and refused to speak about that night. The trauma was settling in, and I felt helpless to stop it. My mother visited despite the legal risks. She brought a tablet, typing messages she couldn't yet speak aloud. She revealed that grandmother had called a family meeting. Attendance was mandatory for all women who'd undergone the ritual. Those who refused would be cut off from the family trust funds that many depended on. The meeting was in 2 days. My mother was terrified but planned to attend. She needed to know what grandmother was planning. I begged her not to go, but she insisted. After 20 years of silence, she was done being afraid. That night, Nylith appeared at the safe house. The police almost arrested her before I confirmed she was family. She'd climbed out a second-story window to escape her husband's supervision. Through sign language and written notes, she conveyed urgent information. Grandmother was planning something big. She'd been meeting with religious leaders from other communities who practiced similar traditions. They were organizing a legal defense fund and preparing to challenge any prosecution as religious persecution. But more concerning was what Nylith had overheard about the family meeting. Grandmother intended to perform an emergency ritual. Multiple girls would undergo the ceremony simultaneously to prove the tradition's importance. She'd already selected the candidates, all under 18. I felt sick. We'd stopped her from taking Lysandria, but other girls would suffer instead. Grandmother was escalating, using the threat of mass mutilation to force the authorities to back down. Detective Martinez listened to Nylith's information with growing alarm. This changed everything. The threat of imminent harm to minors gave them grounds for immediate intervention, but they needed more than hearsay from a traumatized woman. Nylith produced a phone. She'd recorded grandmother discussing the plans with my Aunt Caroline. The audio was muffled but audible. Grandmother's voice clearly stated that 5 girls would undergo the ritual if charges weren't dropped within 48 hours. The police mobilized immediately. This was no longer about past crimes but preventing future ones. They began identifying the potential victims, all cousins between 13 and 17. Child Protective Services was notified, but grandmother had anticipated this. The families had already moved the girls to unknown locations. When police arrived at their homes, they found empty bedrooms and parents who claimed their daughters were at spiritual retreats that they couldn't disclose. The prosecutor finally engaged. The threat against minors changed the legal calculation. They filed emergency injunctions and began preparing arrests for anyone involved in planning the mass ritual. But finding the girls remained the priority. I studied the family patterns, trying to think like grandmother. She valued tradition above all. The mass ritual wouldn't happen in some random location. It would be somewhere significant to our family history. Then I remembered the old family estate 3 hours north. It had been abandoned for decades after a fire destroyed the main house, but the ceremonial buildings remained. Grandmother had taken us there once for a family history lesson. I shared this with Detective Martinez. She dispatched units immediately while keeping others stationed at known family properties. We could only hope I was right. The wait was excruciating. Lysandria clung to my hand as we sat by the phone. Each minute that passed was another minute those girls were in danger. I'd started this by exposing the family secret. If they were hurt because of my actions. The call came after 2 hours. They'd found them. All 5 girls were safe, though terrified. 14 family members had been arrested, including my Aunt Caroline and 3 cousins who'd been preparing the ceremonial space. But grandmother wasn't there. She'd anticipated this too, sending others to do what she couldn't legally do herself. The mastermind remained free while her followers faced consequences. The arrests made national news despite our efforts to keep it local. Religious freedom advocates descended on our town. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse. Some supported us, horrified by the tradition. Others claimed we were attacking religious liberty. Grandmother gave interviews from her home, playing the persecuted elder perfectly. She spoke of centuries of tradition being destroyed by one rebellious teenager. She painted me as mentally unstable, influenced by modern ideas that threatened family values. The other silent women began breaking ranks. Years of conditioned obedience were hard to overcome, but the threat to their daughters had awakened something. My Aunt Beatrice, who'd been silent for 30 years, stood up at a family gathering and spoke a single word. Enough. More voices joined hers. Rusty, damaged, but determined. Women who'd been silenced for decades were finding ways to speak. Some could only whisper. Others managed just a few words, but they were speaking. The family meeting grandmother had planned became something else entirely. Instead of reaffirming the tradition, it became a reckoning. Sisters confronted sisters. Mothers faced daughters. The pain of generations spilled out in halting words and furious signs. Grandmother arrived to find her carefully controlled family in open rebellion. She commanded obedience, invoked tradition, threatened disinheritance. But her voice, which had ruled for so long, was now just one among many. The confrontation was raw. Women she'd silenced surrounded her, their eyes burning with decades of suppressed rage. They didn't touch her, didn't need to. Their presence, their refusal to submit, was violence enough to her worldview. She retreated to her study, the same room where I'd discovered the jars. But the women followed. They demanded answers. Why had she been spared? Who decided she would keep her voice while they lost theirs? The truth emerged in fragments. Grandmother had been selected as the voice of her generation, the one who would speak for all. It was an honor, she insisted. trusted, a sacred responsibility. She'd guided them, protected them, made their decisions when they couldn't speak for themselves, but the women weren't buying it anymore. They'd seen their daughters threatened. They'd watched Lysandria strapped to that table. Funny how grandmother's lawyers keep finding judges who just happen to be her supporters? The timing of that empty hidden room feels awfully convenient too. Someone knew exactly when to clean it out. The tradition that had stolen their voices would not claim another generation. The family split completely. Those still loyal to grandmother retreated to her inner circle, but most chose freedom. They began the long process of healing, of learning to speak again, of reclaiming what had been taken. Legal proceedings ground forward slowly. The arrested family members faced various charges related to conspiracy and child endangerment, but grandmother herself remained untouched, her lawyer successfully arguing she'd neither participated in nor directly ordered the attempted mass ritual. Lysandria started therapy, beginning to process her trauma. She drew pictures of butterflies again, but now they had broken wings learning to fly. Her parents, finally free from grandmother's influence, supported her healing. My mother grew stronger each day. Her voice remained damaged, but she used it. She testified before Child Protective Services about the family tradition. She signed documents removing grandmother's power of attorney. She chose her own words for the first time in 20 years. The investigation expanded as more evidence surfaced. Other families practicing similar traditions were identified. The scope was larger than just our family, though ours was the most extreme. Authorities began treating it as organized child abuse rather than religious practice. But grandmother adapted. She portrayed herself as a scapegoat for broader religious persecution. She gave speeches at religious freedom rallies. She filed lawsuits against the police department, the prosecutor's office, and me personally. The stress was overwhelming. I'd wanted to save Lysandria, and I had, but the cost kept mounting. Death threats arrived daily. Extended family members I'd never met accused me of destroying their heritage. Some nights I wondered if I'd done the right thing. Then I'd see Lysandria smile, hear my mother speak, watch the silent women slowly reclaim their voices, and I knew, whatever the cost, breaking the silence was worth it. The prosecutor built their case methodically. Without the physical evidence of the jars, they focused on testimony and the conspiracy to commit child abuse. It wasn't as strong as they'd hoped, but it might be enough. Grandmother's health began failing. The stress of losing control, of watching her carefully constructed world crumble, took its toll. She was hospitalized twice, each time using it to gain public sympathy. But the silent women weren't swayed by her frailty. They'd suffered for decades under her rule. They organized, creating support groups for recovering their voices. Speech therapists volunteered to help. The healing process was slow but real. More family secrets emerged. Financial records showed grandmother had been embezzling from the family trusts for years. The charities she'd founded were fronts for controlling family members. Her empire of control had been built on more than just tradition. The trial date approached. Witnesses were prepared. Evidence was organized. The entire town held its breath, waiting to see if justice would finally be served. But grandmother had one more card to play. She announced she was dying. Terminal cancer, she claimed. Her lawyer argued that prosecuting a dying elderly woman for religious practices was cruel and unusual. Medical records were subpoenaed. The cancer was real, but hardly terminal. Early stage, highly treatable. But the narrative had been set. Public opinion began shifting back in her favor. I watched it all from the safe house, feeling the walls close in. We'd come so far, exposed so much, saved so many. But grandmother might still escape justice, might still win through manipulation and lies. The silent women refused to give up. They organized a press conference, standing together to show their scars. They couldn't speak clearly, but their presence spoke volumes. These weren't willing participants in a religious ritual. They were victims of systematic abuse. Lysandria asked to participate. I wanted to protect her, but she insisted. She needed to be heard, needed to stand with the women who'd suffered before her. Together, we prepared her statement. The night before the press conference, grandmother made her move. She didn't come herself, but sent a message through my mother. One last offer. Drop everything, leave town, and she'd ensure no other girl underwent the ritual. Fight her, and she'd find ways to continue the tradition regardless. It was tempting. Lysandria would be safe. The other girls would be protected. All I had to do was abandon the fight for justice. Let grandmother win one last time. But I looked at my mother, at her scarred mouth trying to form words of advice. I thought of Nihilith, Zeraphine, Thalia, and all the others who'd suffered. They deserved justice, not just a promise from the woman who'd hurt them. I sent back a single word answer: no. The press conference proceeded as planned. The silent women stood in a line, survivors of a horror that had lasted generations. Lysandria read her statement clearly, her young voice carrying across the crowd. She spoke for all who couldn't, who'd been robbed of their voices before they could choose. The impact was immediate. Public opinion shifted decisively. Religious freedom advocates quietly withdrew support. Even grandmother's staunchest allies began distancing themselves. But the legal case still hinged on evidence and testimony, and grandmother's lawyer was skilled at creating doubt, at making the extraordinary seem impossible. As the trial began, I realized this wasn't ending. Not yet. Grandmother would fight to her last breath to preserve her power, her tradition, her control. The real battle was just beginning. The courtroom doors loomed ahead as I walked through the courthouse lobby. Lysandria gripped my hand tighter with each step. The prosecutor had warned us that grandmother's lawyer would try every trick to discredit our testimony. I'd prepared Lysandria as best I could, but nothing could truly ready a 12-year-old for what awaited inside. Detective Martinez met us at the security checkpoint. Her expression told me everything I needed to know about how the morning had gone. More witnesses had recanted overnight. The defense was painting this as a family dispute blown out of proportion by an unstable teenager seeking attention. We took our seats in the gallery as grandmother entered through a side door. She moved slowly, leaning heavily on a cane I'd never seen her use before. Her lawyer guided her to the defense table with exaggerated care. The performance had already begun. The judge called the court to order. I recognized him from grandmother's charity events over the years. They'd served on the same community boards. The prosecutor had tried to get him recused, but the motion was denied. We were fighting on grandmother's chosen battlefield. The defense presented their case with surgical precision. They called character witnesses who testified about grandmother's decades of charitable work. Religious scholars explained how certain communities practiced voluntary body modification as spiritual devotion. A psychiatrist suggested I suffered from false memory syndrome, implanting trauma where none existed. Each witness chipped away at our credibility. The silent women's testimonies were dismissed as coerced. The video from the grove was reframed as a misunderstanding of religious ceremony. Even the recorded threats against the 5 girls were explained away as metaphorical language taken out of context. Lysandria trembled beside me as we watched our truth twisted into lies. I wanted to stand up and scream the real story, but the prosecutor had warned us to stay silent until called. Any outburst would only fuel the defense's narrative of emotional instability. During a recess, Nylith approached us in the hallway. Through rapid sign language, she conveyed that more family members were wavering. Grandmother had been making calls from her lawyer's office, promising financial support to those who stood by her and ruin to those who didn't. The afternoon brought more setbacks. The judge sustained every defense objection while overruling the prosecutors. Evidence was excluded on technicalities. Testimony was limited to narrow parameters that prevented the full truth from emerging. When Lysandria finally took a stand, grandmother's lawyer transformed from grandfatherly to predator. He questioned her memory, suggested she'd been coached, implied she was seeking attention. My young cousin held up remarkably well, but I saw the cracks forming in her composure. The prosecutor tried to redirect, to let Lysandria tell her story in her own words, but the judge cut her off repeatedly, claiming relevance issues. By the time she left the stand, her testimony had been reduced to fragments that barely conveyed the horror she'd experienced. My turn came next. I'd testified in depositions, given statements to police, but this was different. This was grandmother's arena, where she'd spent decades building influence. Her lawyer attacked my credibility from every angle, bringing up teenage mistakes, questioning my motives, suggesting mental health issues. I tried to stay focused on the facts, the jars, the preparation chamber, the tradition that had silenced generations of women, but each time I gained momentum, an objection would derail me. The judge's bias became more apparent with each ruling. The defense's closing argument painted grandmother as a victim of modern persecution, an elderly woman clinging to ancestral traditions in a world that no longer understood faith. They portrayed me as a troubled teen who'd manufactured a crisis for attention, dragging innocent family members into my delusion. The prosecutor fought back, highlighting the medical evidence, the testimonies that hadn't been recanted, the recorded threats, but the damage was done. The jury looked confused, overwhelmed by competing narratives. The judge's bias is showing more clearly than grandmother's fake limp with that new cane she suddenly needs for sympathy points in court. Reasonable doubt had been expertly sown. We waited in a small room while the jury deliberated. Lysandria had gone quiet, the fight drained out of her by the defense attorney's assault. My mother sat with us, her damaged voice offering whispered reassurances that none of us believed. The verdict came after 6 hours, not guilty on all charges. The courtroom erupted. Grandmother's supporters cheered while our side sat in stunned silence. I watched her rise from the defense table, the fake frailty vanishing as she walked out surrounded by her loyal circle. She paused at our row, making eye contact with me. The slight smile on her lips said everything. She'd won. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Grandmother's lawyer gave a triumphant statement about religious freedom prevailing. The prosecutor slipped out a side door without comment. We were left standing on the steps, defeated and directionless. The safe house felt like a tomb that night. Lysandria hadn't spoken since the verdict. My mother typed messages on her tablet, trying to maintain hope, but her hands shook with each word. The other silent women had scattered, afraid of grandmother's promised retribution. Detective Martinez visited the next morning. The acquittal had emboldened grandmother's supporters. 3 families had already announced their daughters would undergo the ritual to prove their faith. The detective's hands were tied. Without a conviction, they couldn't intervene in what the court had deemed a religious practice. I spent hours on the laptop searching for options: civil suits, federal intervention, media pressure. But each avenue led nowhere. Grandmother's acquittal had legitimized the tradition in the eyes of the law. We'd exposed the truth only to watch it be legally sanctioned. Nylith appeared at the safe house that afternoon. Her husband had thrown her out for testifying. Through sign language and written notes, she explained that grandmother was planning a celebration ceremony. Not the ritual itself, but a gathering to reaffirm the family's commitment to tradition. The invitation arrived the next day. Formal calligraphy on expensive paper. All family members were summoned to witness the reaffirmation of sacred bonds. Attendance was mandatory for anyone wishing to remain in the family. The message was clear: submit or be cast out. My mother faced an impossible choice. Decades of conditioning warred with her newfound voice. The family trust fund that supported her came with strings attached. Defying grandmother meant losing everything. I told her to go, to protect herself, but she refused to abandon us again. The night of the ceremony, we watched from a distance as cars filled grandmother's driveway. Extended family members who'd stayed neutral during the trial now chose sides. Most chose security over freedom. The house blazed with lights as grandmother reclaimed her throne. But something unexpected happened. Zeraphine arrived at our safe house instead of the ceremony. Then Thalia. Then 3 other silent women. They'd made their choice. Freedom over family, truth over tradition. Their rebellion might have failed in court, but it lived on in their refusal to submit. We sat together in the small living room, a makeshift family born from shared trauma. The women signed rapidly, planning next steps, support groups, safe houses, ways to help others escape. The legal system had failed us, but we could still save lives through direct action. Lysandria finally spoke that night, just 3 words: I'm not afraid. It was a lie. We all knew it, but a necessary one. Fear was luxury we couldn't afford if we wanted to protect the next generation. The following weeks brought retaliation. Lawsuits from grandmother claiming defamation despite her acquittal. Harassment from family members who blamed us for the schism. Financial pressure as trust funds were revoked and support systems collapsed. But we adapted. The silent women found their voices in different ways. Some literally, through speech therapy and practice. Others through art, writing, sign language. They created a network of communication that grandmother couldn't control. My mother grew stronger each day. Her voice remained damaged but determined. She found work, the first job she'd ever had outside grandmother's influence. The pay was minimal, but the freedom was priceless. She could choose her own words, make her own decisions. More families quietly reached out, mothers who didn't want their daughters to suffer. Young women approaching 16 who'd heard whispers of what awaited them. We couldn't stop the tradition legally, but we could offer alternatives, safe places to run, people who understood. Grandmother escalated her control over those who remained. The ceremony requirements became stricter. The age dropped to 14 for some families. She was desperate to prove the tradition's strength, but desperation made her reckless. One of the younger cousins, a 15-year-old named Marielle, contacted us through a school counselor. Her ceremony was scheduled for the following month. Her parents were true believers, but she wasn't. We began planning her escape. The extraction happened on a Tuesday afternoon. Marielle left school during lunch and never returned. By the time her parents realized she was gone, she was 3 states away with Zeraphine, heading for a women's shelter that specialized in religious trauma. Grandmother's rage was volcanic. She filed kidnapping charges that were eventually dropped when Marielle confirmed she'd left voluntarily. But the damage to grandmother's image was done. The outside world began to see the cracks in her perfect family facade. More girls followed Marielle's example. An underground railroad of sorts developed, shepherding young women away from the ritual. We used the same networks grandmother had once used to control us, but for liberation instead of subjugation. The financial pressure intensified. Grandmother used her wealth like a weapon, funding lawsuits, hiring private investigators, making our lives miserable through legal means, but we'd learned to live with less. Freedom tasted better than any trust fund. 6 months after the trial, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One of grandmother's former lawyers reached out. His conscience had finally overcome his retainer. He provided documents showing grandmother had hidden assets, structured specifically to maintain control over family members. We couldn't retry the criminal case, but financial fraud was different. The IRS became interested in grandmother's charitable foundations. State regulators examined the trust structures. The empire she'd built on silence began facing scrutiny from angles she hadn't anticipated. Lysandria returned to school, different but not broken. She became fierce advocate for other young girls, using her experience to educate counselors and teachers about signs of family abuse. Her butterflies evolved too, from broken wings to soaring figures. The silent women's support group grew beyond our family. Other communities with similar traditions began reaching out. The legal system had failed us, but grassroots organizing offered hope. Each woman who found her voice inspired others to do the same. Grandmother's health genuinely declined this time. The stress of maintaining control over a fracturing family took its toll. She was hospitalized repeatedly, each time using it to guilt family members into returning. Some did, but fewer each time. The end came quietly on a Thursday morning. Grandmother died in her sleep, surrounded by the few family members who still believed in her vision. The funeral was a strange affair, split between those who mourned a tyrant and those who mourned the grandmother she could have been. Her will revealed one final manipulation. Everything was left to family members who'd undergone the ritual, with provisions requiring future generations to continue the tradition. But legal challenges were already being prepared. The empire built on silence would not survive its architect. The family property was eventually sold, the proceeds distributed among all descendants regardless of their choices. The preparation chamber was demolished. The grove was cleared and planted with a garden. Physical reminders of the tradition were erased, though the scars remained. Some family members reconciled. Others remained forever divided. The tradition survived in pockets, practiced by true believers who'd gone underground. We couldn't save everyone, but we'd saved enough. The chain of silence that had bound generations was broken. Lysandria grew up strong and vocal. She studied law, determined to prevent other families from hiding abuse behind religious freedom. My mother never fully recovered her voice, but she never stopped using it. The silent women became speakers, writers, teachers, and advocates. I found my own path in social work, helping families escape various forms of control and abuse. The skills learned in defying grandmother translated well to helping others find their freedom. Each person saved felt like a small victory against the tradition that had nearly claimed us. Years later, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a mason jar, empty except for a note. Your voice remains your own. I never learned who sent it, but I kept it as reminder. Some victories are measured not in what we destroy, but in what we refuse to surrender. The tradition that had claimed 47 voices over 2 centuries ended not with legal victory or dramatic confrontation, but with quiet resistance. Each woman who kept her tongue, each girl who escaped the ritual, each voice raised in defiance was a testament to the power of breaking silence. We'd lost the battle in court, but won the war for our futures. Grandmother's legacy of control died with her, replaced by a new tradition. Women speaking their truth, no matter the cost. The jars were gone, but our voices remained. That was victory enough. Appreciate you sticking with me while I wandered through all this. Definitely a journey full of questions, huh? Always good to have company along the way. Catch you later. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.